Hey everyone, welcome back to InfoSec Fortress. I'm Rob, and today we're doing a full technical breakdown of the Conduent data breach, which is shaping up to be one of the largest data breaches in US history, now affecting over 25 million Americans and still climbing. We're going to walk through this step by step, how the attackers got in, how they escalated privileges, how they moved laterally, and how they sat inside Conduent's network for nearly 3 months, exfiltrating over 8 terabytes of data without being detected. This is a technical video aimed at IT professionals and cybersecurity practitioners. I want you to understand the kill chain here, because if you're managing infrastructure for any organization that handles PII or PHI, this is a case study in what happens when fundamental security controls are missing. Let's get into it. First, let's establish the timeline, because the timeline alone tells a damning story. October 21, 2024, initial compromise, the attackers gained their first foothold in Conduent's network. October 21, 2024 through January 13, 2025, the attackers have persistent access, nearly 3 months. During this window, they are conducting reconnaissance, escalating privileges, moving laterally, and exfiltrating data. Over 8 terabytes of it. January 13, 2025, Conduent finally detects the intrusion. The detection wasn't from their security monitoring, it was because the attackers triggered an operational disruption. Services went down. EBT payment systems in Wisconsin and Oklahoma stopped working. That's what got noticed, not the massive data exfiltration. April 9, 2025, Conduent files an 8K with the SEC. The language is carefully sanitized. They describe a threat actor who exfiltrated files from a limited number of clients and claim no material operational impact. October 2025, first breach notification letters start going out, 10 months after detection. February 2026, we're now learning the scope is 25 million people and growing. Texas alone went from 4 million to over 15.4 million affected individuals. They're still sending notifications, so that's the timeline. Now let's talk about who did this and how. The SafePay ransomware group claimed responsibility for this attack. They posted Conduent on their Tor-based data leak site in January 2025, claiming over 8 terabytes of stolen data. Some reports say 8.5 terabytes. For those of you not tracking SafePay, here's what you need to know. SafePay emerged in September to October of 2024. They are not a ransomware as a service operation. They're a closed, centralized group. They develop their own encryptor, manage their own infrastructure, and handle their own negotiations. This is significant because it means consistent TTPs across their operations, which is actually useful for defenders building detection rules. Their encryptor is based on leaked Lockbit 3.0 source code, but it's been independently modified. There are also strong operational similarities to the Conti ransomware group. Security researchers believe SafePay includes experienced operators who migrated from previously disbanded groups. Conti, Black Basta, possibly others. These are not amateurs. SafePay's signature is speed. They consistently go from initial access to full encryption in under 24 hours. They use double extortion. Steal your data first, then encrypt, then demand payment for both the decryption key and the promise not to leak the stolen data. Their ransomware binary includes a language check kill switch. If the system is using Cyrillic languages, it won't execute. That's a strong indicator of Eastern European, likely Russian-speaking, operators. Now let's walk through the actual attack chain. This is where it starts, and frankly, this is where the story gets frustrating for anyone in this field. SafePay's primary initial access vector, and this is well documented across multiple incident response reports, is compromised VPN credentials. They obtain valid usernames and passwords, typically through one of 3 methods: purchased credentials from initial access brokers on dark web marketplaces. These are stolen by info stealers, malware like Raccoon, Redline, Vidar, Thatchidulakur Daparin. Atschambucker Becker Dumba Esther Yuru Scurry Creed Dodnoxton. Credentials from infected endpoints and sell them in bulk. Brute force attacks against exposed VPN gateways and RDP endpoints, particularly where password policies are weak, or exploitation of known VPN vulnerabilities, particularly in FortiGate SSL VPN implementations. If your FortiGate isn't patched, you're a target. In all of these scenarios, the common thread is the absence of multi-factor authentication. If MFA is properly enforced on the VPN gateway, stolen credentials alone aren't enough. But if it's not, and at Conduent, based on everything we can infer from the attack, it wasn't, then a valid username and password is all you need. For context, the Change Healthcare breach in 2024, which affected 190 million people, was also caused by a stolen credential on a remote access system that lacked MFA. TechCrunch specifically reported that detail. We appear to be looking at the same class of failure at Conduent. SafePay has also been observed using social engineering, email bombing employees with thousands of spam messages, then calling via Microsoft Teams, impersonating IT support and convincing employees to grant remote access through tools like Microsoft Quick Assist. This is a technique borrowed from Black Basta. Whether this specific method was used at Conduent, we don't know yet, but VPN credential compromise is their go-to, so the attackers are now inside the network with a valid VPN session. To Conduent systems, this looks like a legitimate user connecting remotely. No alerts, no red flags, they're in. Once inside, SafePay immediately begins mapping the environment. Their documented approach is methodical. The first thing they run is ShareFinder PS1 from the PowerSploit PowerTools collection. This is a PowerShell script that enumerates all SMB shares accessible across the domain. It tells the attackers exactly where the data lives: file servers, application shares, database connections, backup locations, everything. They're also enumerating Active Directory structure, domain controllers, organizational units, group memberships, service accounts, network topology, subnets, VLANs, critical servers, installed software and security tools, what antivirus is running, what EDR is deployed, what backup solutions are in place. High-value targets: database servers containing PII and PHI, application servers processing claims and payments. Remember, Conduent processes Medicaid claims, SNAP benefits, child support payments, unemployment benefits, and toll transactions for state governments. Their systems handle data for over 100 million Americans. The reconnaissance phase tells the attackers exactly where all of that data sits. This is all done using built-in Windows tools and PowerShell, what we call living off the land. No custom malware needs to be dropped at this stage, which makes detection much harder because these are legitimate administrative tools being used for illegitimate purposes. The VPN credentials that got them in the door are probably a standard domain user account, maybe a service account, maybe an employee's credentials. That's enough to get on the network, but it's not enough to own it. They need higher privileges. SafePay uses several documented techniques for privilege escalation. UAC bypass via COM object abuse. This is their signature move. They exploit the dolhost.exe process and abuse COM object functionality, specifically the CMS TPLUA COM interface, to execute commands with elevated privileges. This bypasses Windows user account control without triggering a UAC prompt. The result: local administrator or system-level access on the compromised endpoint. Token impersonation. If the UAC bypass isn't sufficient or they need different credentials, they'll impersonate security tokens from other logged-in users or services to assume their privileges. Credential harvesting. This is ongoing throughout the attack. They're dumping credentials from memory, harvesting cached credentials, extracting service account passwords. Tools like Mimikatz or similar credential dumping utilities give them domain admin credentials. Once they have domain administrator privileges, the game is essentially over. Domain admin means they control Active Directory. They can access any system, any share, any database on the domain. They can create new accounts, modify group policies, disable security tools, anything. And this is the critical point. With domain admin access on a flat, unsegmented network, which is what we appear to be dealing with at Conduent, there is no barrier between the attacker and the crown jewels. Before moving to data collection, SafePay systematically disables the defensive tools that might detect them. Windows Defender, they disable real-time protection, cloud-delivered protection, sample submission, and behavior monitoring. This is done through registry modifications, group policy changes, or direct PowerShell commands using setmpreference. They also add folder exclusions to prevent Defender from scanning their tools and staged data. Third-party security tools, they terminate processes associated with antivirus software, EDR agents, and backup solutions. Any security tool that might flag their activities gets killed. Volume Shadow Copy Service, they stop the VSS service and delete all existing shadow copies. This is preparation for the ransomware phase. Without shadow copies, the victim can't do a simple volume restore. Boot configuration modification. They modify boot configuration data to prevent system recovery options. Event log clearing. They clear Windows security, system and application event logs to cover their tracks and make forensic analysis harder. Anti-forensic scripts. After completing their objectives, they deploy cleanup scripts to remove artifacts of their presence. All of this is done using legitimate Windows utilities, lolbins, regex for registry changes, webtutle for log clearing, vsadmin for shadow copy deletion, bcdedit for boot configuration. These are all signed Microsoft binaries. Your application whitelisting won't flag them. Your antivirus won't flag them. Your EDR might, if it's still running. With domain admin credentials and security tools disabled, the attackers now move across the network to reach the systems that contain the data they want. SafePay's lateral movement toolkit is straightforward and effective. Microsoft's sysinternals tool for remote command execution. With admin credentials, sysinternals tools lets you execute commands on any system in the domain. RDP, Remote Desktop Protocol. Direct interactive sessions to target systems. WinRM, Windows Remote Management. PowerShell remoting for command execution across systems. Administrative shares, CDO, ADMIN, and other default administrative shares for file transfer between systems. RMM software. In some cases, SafePay installs legitimate remote management tools like ConnectWise Screen Connect for persistent remote access that blends in with normal IT operations. They're moving from system to system, targeting database servers, where the PII and PHI are stored, application servers, where claims processing, eligibility checks, and payment processing happen, file servers, where client data and documents are stored, backup infrastructure, to ensure the victim can't recover without paying. In a properly segmented network, lateral movement would be constrained. Database servers holding PHI would be in isolated network segments with strict access controls. Application servers would be separated from general corporate infrastructure. Jump boxes and privileged access workstations would be required for administrative access. But 8 terabytes of exfiltrated data across nearly 3 months suggests that network segmentation at Conduent was either inadequate or non-existent. This is the part that should concern every IT professional in this audience. Conduent handles data for state government programs, Medicaid, SNAP, child support, unemployment, toll systems. We're talking about names, social security numbers, dates of birth, addresses, medical information, health insurance details. The most sensitive categories of PII and PHI you can imagine. For some of the most vulnerable populations in the country, the question everyone should be asking is, why was this data accessible in clear text? Here's the architectural reality that most people outside of IT don't understand. Conduent systems have to actively process this data 24/7. They're running eligibility checks, processing claims, generating payments, producing reports. To do any of that, the data has to be decrypted and available to the application layer. You can encrypt data at rest, when it's sitting on disk in a database. You can encrypt data in transit, when it's moving between systems over the network. Most organizations do both of these, and Conduent likely did as well. But there's a third state, data in use. When the application server is actively processing a Medicaid claim, it needs the member's SSN, their medical information, their eligibility data, all in clear text, in memory, accessible to the application. Because Conduent systems run around the clock, this data is essentially always in an unencrypted, usable state on the application servers. The moment the attackers gained access to those servers, which they did with domain admin privileges, they had access to clear text PII and PHI. This isn't unique to Conduent. This is how most enterprise systems work, but that's exactly the point. When you're processing data for 100 million Americans, that's how everyone does it, isn't an acceptable risk posture. Technologies exist for confidential computing and encryption in use, but they're not widely adopted. At minimum, proper network segmentation, database activity monitoring, and data loss prevention controls should have been in place to detect and prevent mass data exfiltration. Now we get to the exfiltration phase, and this is where the failure of Conduent's monitoring and detection capabilities becomes impossible to ignore. SafePay's documented exfiltration process. Target identification. They identify files likely to be valuable based on file extensions and names. Financial data, invoices, client lists, credentials, intellectual property. And in Conduent's case, the client data files containing PII and PHI for millions of people. Compression and staging. They use WinRM, or 7-zip, to compress the data into archives. This reduces the volume for transfer and can help evade DLP tools that inspect content types. Exfiltration. The compressed archives are transferred out using FileZilla, FTP, SFTP, ArcLone, which can sync to cloud storage providers, or in smaller operations, even the RDP clipboard. SafePay has also been observed uninstalling exfiltration tools after use to reduce forensic evidence. Now think about this. 8 terabytes. Even compressed, we're talking about massive sustained data transfer out of Conduent's network over the course of weeks. Where were the network monitoring tools? Where was the DLP? Where were the egress traffic alerts? If your network suddenly starts pushing terabytes of data to external FTP servers or cloud storage endpoints, that should trigger every alarm you have. Either Conduent didn't have adequate network monitoring and DLP in place, or they had it and nobody was watching. Either scenario is a catastrophic failure for an organization that serves as a data processor for state and federal government programs. For perspective, 8 terabytes is roughly equivalent to 4 billion pages of text documents, or about 2 million hours of audio. This wasn't a surgical extraction of a single database. This was a wholesale looting of Conduent's data assets over nearly 3 months. After the data was safely exfiltrated, SafePay deployed their ransomware payload. This is the final phase: encrypt the systems and present the ransom demand. SafePay's ransomware binary is a PE32 DLL file, executed via regsvr32.exe, with a mandatory password argument that decodes the embedded configuration. The encryption uses SHA-20 or AES depending on the target system's hardware capabilities, with per-file keys protected through asymmetric cryptography. There is currently no public decryptor. Encrypted files get the .safepay extension, and a ransom note titled readme safepay.ext is placed in affected directories. SafePay typically gives a 72-hour initial deadline to create urgency. They also target hypervisors and virtual machines, ESXi environments, extending the destruction beyond physical systems. The ransomware deployment is what caused the operational disruption that Conduent detected on January 13th. EBT payment systems went down in multiple states, government services were disrupted, parents couldn't process child support payments, benefit recipients couldn't access their funds. That's what finally got noticed. Not the months of data theft, but the systems going offline. Let me summarize the security control failures we can identify or reasonably infer from this breach. Multi-factor authentication, either not implemented or not enforced on VPN or remote access. This is the front door. Without MFA, stolen credentials are a skeleton key. Network segmentation, inadequate or non-existent. The attackers moved from their initial foothold to database and application servers containing PHI for tens of millions of people. Proper segmentation would have created barriers, requiring additional exploitation at each boundary. Privileged access management. Domain admin credentials were obtainable and usable without additional controls. PAM solutions, just-in-time access, and privileged access workstations would have complicated the privilege escalation chain significantly. Endpoint detection and response, either not deployed comprehensively or not tuned to detect the LOL bin techniques SafePay uses. The UAC bypass, share finder execution, and credential dumping should have triggered alerts. Network monitoring and DLP, 8 terabytes of data left the network over weeks without detection. That's a failure of network traffic analysis, data loss prevention, and egress monitoring. Data in use protection, PHI and PII were accessible in cleartext on application and database servers. While this is common in the industry, it shouldn't be acceptable for an organization processing data at this scale. Security operations, threat hunting, 3 months of dwell time. No proactive threat hunting identified the intrusion. The detection was reactive, caused by the operational disruption of the ransomware deployment, not by security monitoring. Incident response and disclosure. While not a preventive control, the 10-month gap between detection and meaningful notification, combined with the deliberate obfuscation of the breach notice, represents a failure of the incident response process. Here's what you should be doing right now if you're responsible for IT security at any organization. Audit your remote access. Every VPN gateway, every RDP endpoint, every remote access solution. MFA must be enforced. No exceptions, no legacy systems grandfathered in without it. Assess your network segmentation. Can a compromised workstation reach your database servers? Can a VPN user access systems they don't need? Segment your crown jewels. Implement zero trust network access where possible. Implement privileged access management. Domain admin credentials should not be usable from standard workstations. Implement tiered administration, just-in-time access, and monitor all privileged account usage. Deploy and tune your EDR. Make sure it's on every endpoint, including servers. Tune it to detect LOL bin abuse, UAC bypasses, credential dumping, and lateral movement patterns. Monitor your egress. Know what normal outbound traffic looks like. Alert on anomalies. Block unauthorized FTP, cloud storage sync tools, and large data transfers to unknown destinations. Know your vendor risk. If you're a Blue Cross Blue Shield plan, a state government agency, or any organization that shares data with third-party processors, you need to understand how those processors protect your data. Do you encrypt? Is not a sufficient question when the data is decrypted during processing. The Conduent breach is still unfolding. The victim count is at 25 million and climbing. Investigations are underway in Texas and other states. Multiple class action lawsuits have been filed, and Conduent still hasn't disclosed the full scope or the technical details of how the breach occurred. What we do know, based on SafePay's documented TTPs and the available facts, paints a picture of fundamental security control failures at an organization that processes some of the most sensitive data in the country for some of the most vulnerable populations. If you found this breakdown useful, hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. I'll be doing a follow-up video on the disclosure and notification timeline, because that's a whole separate story that deserves its own deep dive. Until next time, patch your VPNs, enforce your MFA, and segment your networks. This is Rob with InfoSec Fortress. Stay secure.